The combat arena stretched wide before Katie Morrison, its metallic floor gleaming under the artificial lights of Station Xena 7. And she held her sword steady as dozens of alien cadets filed into the observation galleries above. The weapon in her hands was simple steel, forged on Earth using techniques that dated back 3,000 years. And it felt right in her grip despite the stares from every direction. "Is that a ceremonial piece?" Zixara asked, her Pelthian features showing genuine curiosity rather than mockery, which made her different from most of the other students. Katie shook her head and ran her thumb along the blade's edge. "No, it's fully functional," she said quietly, watching as Instructor Velthor entered the arena from the opposite side. The Krindak stood nearly 8 feet tall, his forearms moving with practiced grace as he activated the holographic display that would control today's training simulation, and his scaled hide caught the light in patterns of deep purple and black. "Today, we test your readiness for advanced combat scenarios," Velthor announced, his voice carrying easily across the space without any need for amplification. "Each of you will face autonomous plasma drones in a live-fire exercise." Murmurs rippled through the gathered students, most of them excited or nervous. And Katie noticed several glancing her way with expressions she had learned to recognize during her 6 months at the academy. They thought humans didn't belong here, that Earth had stumbled into space travel through luck rather than skill, and that humanity's admission to the Confederation military program was more about politics than capability. "You will use standard-issue equipment," Velthor continued, gesturing to a rack of plasma rifles, energy shields, and photon blades that hummed with barely contained power. "The drones are programmed to match your skill level, but will increase in difficulty if you perform well." Katie raised her hand, the gesture drawing immediate attention, and Velthor's eyes fixed on her with something that looked like anticipation. "Yes, human?" he said, making her species sound like a question rather than a statement. "I request permission to use my own weapon," Katie said, lifting the sword slightly so everyone could see it clearly. The arena fell silent for exactly 3 heartbeats. Then laughter erupted from multiple galleries at once, and even some of the instructors standing near Velthor allowed themselves thin smiles. "You cannot be serious," Velthor said, though his tone suggested he hoped she was. "That is a primitive metal blade." "Yes, sir," Katie replied, keeping her voice level and respectful. "The drones fire superheated plasma that can melt through ship armor," Velthor continued, walking closer to her with all 4 arms spreading wide in a gesture that his species used to show disbelief. "You cannot block plasma with steel. I understand the properties of plasma weapons," Katie said. Commander Ryan Blake stood in the instructor's gallery, his jaw tight with concern. And Katie caught his eye for just a moment before looking back at Voltharian had warned her that morning that every human at the academy carried the weight of their entire species' reputation. That failure here meant fewer opportunities for humans across Confederation space, and that she should be careful not to make them look foolish. But Katie had made her decision 3 days ago, when she first learned about this exercise. "I'm willing to accept full responsibility for the outcome," she added when Velthor didn't immediately respond. The instructor's face showed something complex, a mixture of contempt and eagerness, and Katie realized he wanted her to embarrass herself in front of everyone. "Very well," Velthor said slowly, making sure his voice carried to every observer. "I will allow this, so that you and your species can learn a valuable lesson about respecting the technological superiority that built this confederation." He returned to the control panel and began entering commands while Katie moved to the starting position marked on the arena floor. Era leaned over the railing from her spot in the gallery and called down softly, "Katie, you don't have to do this," she said, her voice concerned. "No one will think less of you if you use proper equipment." "Thank you," Katie replied, offering a small smile. "But I need to do this my way." She thought about Greg Patterson, a mentor back on Earth who had spent 40 years teaching ancient weapons techniques to modern soldiers, and who had told her something important on the day she left for the academy. "The blade doesn't make you dangerous," he had said while they stood in the training hall where she had spent countless hours. "Your mind does, and the sword just gives it form." Velther's voice echoed across the arena again. "The simulation will begin in 30 seconds, he announced. 3 drones for the first wave, standard difficulty. Lethal force authorized but limited to training parameters." Katie settled into her stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. Sword held in a middle guard position that allowed quick movement in any direction. Her heart beat steady in her chest, not with fear, but with focus. And she let her breathing fall into the rhythm that Greg had drilled into her until it became automatic around her. The arena's environmental systems activated, creating obstacles and cover points that rose from the floor, and holographic markers appeared to designate no-go zones that would count as mission failure if entered. 15 seconds. Velther said. Katie closed her eyes for just a moment and centered herself, letting go of the pressure and the watching eyes and the knowledge that she represented something larger than herself when she opened them again. All she saw was the arena and the tactical situation. 5 seconds. 3 panels in the far wall slid open, and cylindrical drones emerged, each one hovering on anti-gravity fields, their sensor arrays glowing red as they acquired their target. Katie took one deep breath and released it slowly. "Begin." Velther commanded the drones, spread out immediately, their movement coordinated by whatever algorithm controlled them. And Katie stayed perfectly still as they positioned themselves at different angles and distances. First plasma bolt came from her left, a streak of superheated particles that screamed through the air. And Katie moved. She didn't run or dodge wildly, but shifted her weight and turned her body with minimal motion, letting the bolt pass close enough that she felt its heat. And in the same movement, she angled her blade. The second bolt came from straight ahead, and this time Katie's sword flashed in an arc that defied what every observer thought. They knew about physics and weapons and the way combat worked. Plasma bolt struck the blade's edge at precisely 37 degrees and deflected upward, dispersing into the air instead of burning through metal. And Katie was already moving toward the third drone before anyone could process what they had just seen. The galleries erupted in confusion and shouting, but Katie heard none of it. Lost in the flow of combat where thought and action merged into something that felt like breathing. She had learned long ago that technology had limitations, but human adaptability did not. And right now she intended to prove it. The third drone fired before Katie reached it. 3 rapid shots meant to saturate her position, and she rolled beneath the first while deflecting the second with a rising sweep of her blade. The third bolt missed entirely because she wasn't where the drone's targeting system predicted she would be, and in the half second while it recalculated, Katie closed the distance. Her sword struck the drone's lower section where the anti-gravity generator connected to the weapon housing, and the machine spun wildly before crashing to the arena floor with sparks flying from its damaged systems. "Impossible," someone muttered in the galleries. The word carrying in the sudden quiet that followed Katie didn't pause to acknowledge the reaction, but instead turned to face the remaining 2 drones, which had adjusted their tactics and now fired in alternating patterns to prevent her from timing her deflections. She moved laterally, using one of the raised obstacles for partial cover, and studied their rhythm with the focus that Greg had spent years teaching her to develop. Every weapon had patterns. He used to say, even ones controlled by computers, because those computers were programmed by beings who thought in patterns themselves. The drones orbited around her position, maintaining distance And Katie noticed they were trying to force her into the no-go zones that would end the exercise in failure-smart programming. She thought, adjusting her stance and waiting for the right moment, a Krindak's instructor standing near. Velther leaned close and spoke in a voice that nonetheless carried across the arena. She is using deflection angles to disrupt the plasma's magnetic containment, he said with clear amazement in his tone. The timing required would be nearly impossible for most species to calculate consciously. Muscle memory, Ryan Blake said from his position in the command gallery, speaking loudly enough for others to hear. Humans train extensively in physical skills until they become automatic reactions that bypass conscious thought. Velther said nothing, but his four hands gripped the control panel with obvious tension in the arena. Katie made her move. She sprinted directly at one drone. Her sword held low, and when it fired, she dropped into a slide that carried her beneath the bolt, while her blade swept upward in a stroke that she had practiced 10,000 times. The drone exploded in a shower of components and flickering energy, and Katie used the momentum of her slide to spring back to her feet and charge the final drone. This one tried to retreat, its programming recognizing a threat it wasn't designed to handle. But Katie had already anticipated the movement and changed her angle of approach. She ran 3 steps up a tilted obstacle, pushed off with enough force to launch herself airborne, and brought her sword down in an overhead strike that split the drone's central housing cleanly in two when she landed, breathing hard but controlled. The arena floor was littered with destroyed machines and scorch marks from plasma fire complete. Silence held for exactly 5 seconds. Then Zixara began the slow, rhythmic applause that her people used to show respect for worthy opponents. And gradually other species joined with their own gestures of acknowledgement. Some clicked mandibles or stomped feet, while others flashed bioluminescent patterns. And Katie stood there wondering if she should bow or salute or simply leave. Velther's voice cut through the growing noise. Silence, he commanded. And the galleries obeyed immediately. What we have witnessed is interesting but proves nothing. He moved to the control panel with quick, angry motions of all 4 arms. The first wave was standard difficulty, he continued, his eyes fixed on Katie with something that looked dangerous. Perhaps the humans simply benefited from fortune or the drones' tactical limitations. Ryan Blake stood abruptly in the command gallery. Instructor Velther. The exercise parameters called for 3 drones, he said formally. Lieutenant Morrison has completed the assigned task. I am the senior combat instructor, Velther replied without looking away from Katie. And I determine when an evaluation is complete. He entered new commands into the panel. 6 drones, he announced. Military-grade targeting systems, adaptive learning enabled. Several gasps came from the galleries, because adaptive learning meant the drones would analyze Katie's techniques and adjust their tactics in real time. This is highly irregular. Another instructor protested. A being whose species Katie didn't recognize. The safety parameters are still active, Velther interrupted. I am simply testing the human's actual capabilities rather than accepting a demonstration that may have been rehearsed. Katie understood what was happening and felt no anger, only a cold assessment of the new situation. Velther wanted to prove that humans were inferior, that her success had been luck. And he was willing to bend regulations to make his point. She could refuse and probably should. But refusing would mean accepting that she couldn't handle a challenge that teams of 5 cadets normally face together. I accept the additional test, Katie said clearly. Settling back into her ready stance, Ryan started to object, but stopped when Katie shook her head slightly. And in his face she saw worry mixed with something else. Perhaps pride or hope. The 6 new drones emerged from wall panels on all sides of the arena, surrounding Katie in a formation that eliminated easy escape routes. These machines were larger than the training models. Their armor plating marked with serial numbers from actual military production lines, and their weapon ports glowed with barely restrained energy. Katie's hands tightened on her sword's grip. The drones didn't attack immediately, but instead began circling, their sensors sweeping across her, gathering data about her stance and position and probable responses. This was the adaptive learning in action. The machines building predictive models before committing to an assault. She remembered a training session with Greg when she was 16. Frustrated because she kept falling into patterns that her sparring partners could exploit. "Don't think about what you're going to do," he had told her while they took a break. "Think about what they expect you to do, then do something else." Katie closed her eyes for just a second and made a decision when the drones attacked, coming from 4 directions simultaneously in a coordinated strike designed to be impossible to counter. Katie did something none of them expected. She threw her sword. The blade tumbled through the air with perfect rotation, driven by a throw she had practiced until her arms ached. And it struck one drone's sensor array with enough force to shatter the delicate equipment, while that drone spun wildly with its targeting systems destroyed. Katie was already moving. She rolled toward the nearest destroyed drone from the first wave and grabbed a piece of its broken housing, a jagged section of metal plating, and she used it to deflect a plasma bolt that would have caught her in the back. The remaining 5 drones adjusted their tactics, 2 moving to cut off her access to weapons while 3 maintained suppressing fire. Katie ran, not away, but toward the drone she had blinded with her thrown sword. And she grabbed her blade from where it had fallen after the impact. A plasma bolt grazed her shoulder, burning through her uniform and searing her skin. And she felt the sharp pain but pushed it aside. Pain was information. Greg used to say, nothing more and nothing less. And information could be used. 2 drones positioned themselves above her, using their anti-gravity systems to gain altitude advantage, while the others maintained ground-level firing positions. Katie analyzed the situation. In the fraction of a second she had available and made another decision that seemed insane to everyone watching. She sprinted directly at one of the ground-level drones, her sword held ready, and when it fired, she deflected the bolt at an angle that sent it streaking upward. The plasma struck one of the aerial drones, and the machine's systems went haywire from the unexpected damage. 3 drones remained functional, plus the 2 damaged ones, and they were learning from every exchange, adapting their tactics, making it harder for Katie to predict their attacks. Her shoulder throbbed where the plasma had burned her, and sweat ran down her face, but her breathing stayed controlled, and her mind stayed clear. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived the Third World War by combining old farming methods with new technology, who had taught young Katie that humans survived because they adapted, because they learned, because they never stopped trying. The drones closed in, and Katie smiled. This was exactly where she needed to be. The 3 functional drones coordinated their attack with precision that spoke to their adaptive learning systems working at full capacity. And Katie knew she couldn't keep deflecting forever. Her shoulder burned with pain. Her muscles were beginning to fatigue, and the drones were positioning themselves to eliminate the angles she had been exploiting. She needed to change the equation entirely. 1 drone hovered near a power conduit that fed energy to the arena's environmental systems. Its position tactically sound, but close to infrastructure that Katie suddenly realized she could use. She feinted toward a different target, drawing fire from 2 drones, then reversed direction with explosive speed and threw her sword again. This time the blade didn't strike a drone directly, but instead hit the power conduit with enough force to rupture its housing, and electricity arced across the damaged section in brilliant white streaks. The nearby drone systems went haywire from the electromagnetic interference, its anti-gravity failing, and it crashed to the floor while sparks danced across its armor plating. Katie didn't wait to see if it would recover, but instead ran to the nearest destroyed drone and grabbed its plasma core, a cylindrical unit that still held residual charge. "She's using their own weapons," Zixara said in the gallery, her voice filled with something like awe. "She's adapting faster than they are." The two remaining functional drones recalculated their approach, splitting up to attack from opposite sides. But Katie had already studied their movement patterns. She waited until they committed to their firing solutions, then activated the plasma core she held. The crude weapon discharged with less precision than a proper rifle, but enough power to catch one drone's center mass, and its shields overloaded in a cascade of failing systems. The final drone, its adaptive programming pushed beyond its design parameters by an opponent it couldn't categorize, made a decision that sealed its fate. It moved in close for a point-blank shot that would be impossible to deflect. And Katie let it come at the last possible moment. She dropped flat and rolled, grabbing her sword from where she had left it near the damaged conduit. And when the drone corrected its aim downward, she was already moving her blade swept through the air in an arc that Greg would have recognized as a technique from the old manuals. A rising strike meant for mounted opponents, and it caught the drone's weapon port at the perfect angle. The machine's own plasma discharge, combined with Katie's strike, created a feedback loop that overloaded its core systems, and the drone exploded in a shower of components that rained across the arena floor. Katie stood in the center of the destruction, breathing hard, her shoulder bleeding, her uniform scorched in 3 places, and her sword held steady despite everything. Simulation ended with a harsh tone that echoed across the space for 10 full seconds. Nobody moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe. Then the arena erupted. Some observers cheered while others argued loudly, and several instructors were already accessing their data tablets to review the recorded footage because they couldn't believe what their eyes had shown them. Tar stood at the control panel with all 4 hands gripping its edge, hard enough that the metal creaked, his face showing emotions that his species usually kept private. Tryon Blake vaulted over the gallery railing in a move that was probably against regulations and jogged across the arena floor to reach Katie. "Medical team is on the way," he said when he got close, his eyes checking her injuries. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen." "Maybe both," Katie replied, wincing as the adrenaline began to fade and the pain in her shoulder became harder to ignore as Ixara appeared moments later, having taken the stairs rather than jumping. And she looked at Katie with clear respect. "In my culture, we have legends of warriors who fought with such skill that they seemed to see the future," she said quietly. "I thought they were only stories." "It's not seeing the future," Katie said, letting Ryan take her sword so she could press her hand against her wounded shoulder. "It's understanding patterns and probabilities, making decisions faster than your opponent can react." The medical team arrived with scanning equipment and emergency supplies, and they immediately began treating Katie's plasma burn while asking questions about pain levels and dizziness. They descended from the control platform, and the crowd of gathering students and instructors parted to let him through. He stopped 3 meters from Katie and stood there in silence while the medical team worked, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "I have been an instructor at this academy for 23 years, he said, his voice carrying easily despite the background noise. "I have trained elite soldiers from 40 different species." He paused, and Katie met his eyes directly. "What you did should have been impossible," Felther continued. "The reaction times required, the precision of your deflections, the tactical improvisation. These things should not exist in a species as young and unproven as humanity. Yet here we are," Ryan said quietly, his tone careful but firm. Val's 4 hands moved in a gesture that Katie had learned meant acknowledgement among his people. "Yes," he agreed. "Here we are indeed. one of the senior instructors. A being named High Instructor Mara Cole, whose species resembled tall, crystalline structures. Approached with several others following Instructor Velther, she said formally, "We need to discuss the safety protocol override you initiated." Velther straightened, clearly recognizing he faced consequences for his actions. "I take full responsibility," he said. "My decision to escalate the simulation beyond approved parameters was mine alone. We will address that in private," Mara Cole replied, then turned her multifaceted eyes toward Katie. "Lieutenant Morrison, your performance today has raised significant questions about our combat curriculum." Katie wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply nodded while the medical technician finished, sealing her wound with synthetic skin. "The Confederation's military doctrine is built on technological superiority," Mara Cole continued, speaking now to the assembled group. "We teach that advanced weapons and defensive systems are the foundation of effective combat." She gestured toward the destroyed drones scattered across the arena floor. "This human has demonstrated that doctrine may be incomplete," she said. "We must consider what other assumptions we have made that may be incorrect." Velther's expression shifted to something complex. "I challenged her because I believed humans were inferior," he said slowly, as if the words were difficult. "My people lost territory to human forces 5 years ago, and I blamed their tactics rather than acknowledging that perhaps our own approach had weaknesses." "That's remarkably honest," Ryan observed. "Honesty is necessary for growth," Velther replied, then looked directly at Katie. "I formally request that you demonstrate your techniques in a proper instructional setting so that we may all learn from them." Katie glanced at Ryan, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "I can do that," she said. "But I should tell you that what I did today wasn't about the sword being better than plasma weapons." "Then what was it about?" Zixara asked. "It was about understanding that every tool has strengths and limitations," Katie explained, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her. "Plasma weapons are incredibly powerful, but they operate on principles that can be disrupted or redirected if you understand those principles." She picked up her sword from where Ryan had set it down. "This blade is simple, which means it's predictable and reliable. But it requires skill to use effectively," she continued. "Technology can amplify our abilities, but it can't replace fundamental combat skills like awareness, timing, and adaptation. Humans seem to excel at adaptation," another instructor noted. "Is this a species-wide trait?" Katie thought about Earth's history, about the countless wars and disasters and challenges that her people had faced and survived. "We've had to adapt," she said simply. "Our planet taught us that the universe doesn't care about our plans or preferences, so we learned to change, to improvise, to use whatever tools we had available." "A harsh teacher," Velther observed. "The best teachers usually are." Katie replied Mara Cole made a sound that might have been her species' version of a thoughtful hum. "This situation requires careful consideration," she said. "For now, Lieutenant Morrison, you should rest and allow your injuries to heal fully, and we will reconvene tomorrow to discuss how to proceed." The gathered crowd began to disperse slowly, though many students and instructors lingered to examine the destroyed drones and review the combat footage on their personal devices. Katie let Ryan guide her toward the exit, her body suddenly feeling the full weight of exhaustion. "You know this isn't over," Ryan said quietly as they walked. "You've challenged their entire understanding of combat effectiveness." "I know," Katie replied. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." Behind them, Velther stood alone in the arena, looking at the destruction and perhaps reconsidering everything he thought he knew about strength, superiority, and the nature of warfare itself. The medical bay's lights were deliberately soft, designed to promote healing for a dozen different species, And Katie sat on the examination platform while a technician ran final scans of her shoulder. 2 days had passed since the arena incident, and her wound had healed remarkably well thanks to advanced medical technology. Though a thin scar remained as a reminder, Ryan stood near the doorway, reviewing something on his data tablet, and his expression suggested the news wasn't particularly good. "The Confederation Military Council wants a full report," he said without looking up. "They're concerned about what your performance means for their strategic doctrine." "Concerned how?" Katie asked, rotating her shoulder to test its range of motion. "They've built their entire military philosophy on technological superiority," Ryan explained, finally meeting her eyes. "The idea that a human with a sword can defeat systems designed to kill armored targets that creates uncomfortable questions." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Some council members are arguing that humans are too unpredictable, that our unconventional tactics make us unreliable allies," he continued. "Others think we should be studied more carefully, maybe given greater responsibilities, and some probably think we're a threat." Katie added quietly. "Yes," Ryan admitted. The technician finished her scans and nodded approval. And Katie stood, pulling on a fresh uniform that the Academy had provided. Zix re-entered the medical bay just as Katie was fastening the last seal, and the Pelthian's face showed signs of distress. "You need to come to the command gallery," she said urgently. "Velther has issued a formal challenge." Katie and Ryan exchanged glances, then followed Zixara through the station's corridors while she explained what had happened. "He invoked the right of teaching," Zixara said as they walked quickly. "It's an old tradition in the Academy that allows an instructor to challenge a student to honor combat if they believe important principles are at stake." "Honor combat?" Katie asked. "Non-lethal, but using full-contact training weapons," Zixara clarified. "The weapons simulate real damage through neural feedback. So the pain is real, even though actual injuries are prevented." They reached the command gallery, where Mara Cole and several other senior instructors were gathered around a holographic display. And Velther stood off to one side with his forearms crossed. "Lieutenant Morrison," Mara Cole said formally when Katie entered. "Instructor Velther has exercised a rarely used Academy regulation." The holographic display showed text in multiple languages, and Katie's translator implant rendered it in English. "He claims that your demonstration in the arena was not representative of repeatable skill," Mara Cole continued, "and that a controlled test against a trained opponent would prove whether your techniques have actual combat value." Katie looked at Velther, trying to read his expression. "This is about more than just me, isn't it?" she asked directly. "Yes," Velther said, his voice steady. "My people believe that humanity's success in conflicts against us was due to luck and circumstances, not genuine capability." He moved one hand in a gesture Katie recognized as sincerity. "I need to know the truth," he added. "If I defeat you decisively, it confirms what my people believe. But if you demonstrate consistent skill against an intelligent opponent, then we must reconsider our assumptions. And if I refuse the challenge?" Katie asked. "Then the question remains unanswered," Mara Cole said. "And many species in the Confederation will continue to view humans as unproven, perhaps even fraudulent in their claims of capability." Ryan stepped forward. "This puts unfair pressure on Lieutenant Morrison," he said firmly. "She represents herself, not all of humanity." "That's technically true," another instructor said. "A being whose species resembled upright reptiles with elaborate crests. But symbolism matters in military culture, and whether we like it or not, this situation has become symbolic." Katie thought about her options carefully, refusing. The challenge would be the safe choice, but it would mean accepting that humans remained on the periphery of Confederation military structure, given support roles but not trusted with command or critical operations. Accepting meant facing Velther in single combat. Knowing he had decades of experience and significant physical advantages, how much time do I have to decide? Katie asked. The challenge must be answered within 3 days, Maricole replied. After that, it's considered refused by default. I need to talk to someone back on Earth, Katie said. Is that possible? Communication is permitted, Maricole confirmed. Katie left the command gallery with Ryan following, and they made their way to the station's communication center where long-range transmissions could be arranged. The time lag to Earth was nearly 40 minutes each way. But Katie didn't mind waiting because she needed Greg Patterson's wisdom more than she needed quick answers. She recorded her message, explaining the situation carefully and asking for advice, then sent it on its way through the vast distances between stars while they waited for a response. Ryan brought them both coffee from the station's commissary. You know you don't have to do this, he said as they sat in the quiet communication room. Nobody would blame you for refusing, wouldn't they? Katie asked. I've heard the whispers. Ryan, people saying humans got lucky, that we stumbled into space and don't really belong here. Those people are idiots, Ryan said flatly. Maybe, Katie agreed. But they're idiots with influence over military policy, over which species get advanced training and which ones get relegated to cargo transport and defensive positions. She sipped her coffee and stared at the wall display that showed Earth as a tiny blue point impossibly far away. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the war, Katie said quietly, about how humans were on the edge of extinction, how we had destroyed so much of our own planet. I've read the history, Ryan said. She told me that humanity survived because we learned to combine everything, old knowledge and new technology. Individual courage and collective cooperation, Katie continued. She said that our strength wasn't in being the best at any one thing, but in being able to synthesize everything into something that worked. An hour passed, then another. And finally, the communication terminal chimed with an incoming message. Greg Patterson's face appeared on the screen, looking older than Katie remembered, but with eyes that still held the sharpness of a lifelong warrior. Katie, he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone speaking to a favored student. I've thought about your situation carefully, he paused, and Katie could see him choosing his words. The question isn't whether you can beat Velthor, Greg continued. The question is what you're really fighting for. Katie leaned forward, listening intently. If you fight to prove human superiority, you're playing their game by their rules, Greg said. But if you fight to demonstrate that different approaches have value, that synthesis is stronger than purity, then you're changing the conversation itself. He smiled. Remember what I taught you about the sword, he added. It's not a weapon of dominance, but a tool of understanding distance, timing, intention, and the flow of combat. The message continued for several more minutes, Greg offering specific technical advice and strategic observations. And when it ended, Katie sat in silence for a long moment. He's right, she finally said to Ryan. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about showing that there's more than one way to approach combat. So you're accepting the challenge? Ryan asked. Yes, Katie said, but I need 3 days to prepare. And I need Zixar's help. Ryan raised an eyebrow. What are you planning? Katie smiled. To learn everything I can about Krindak's fighting styles, she said, and to figure out how to teach while I fight. The next 3 days passed in intensive preparation. Zixra brought Katie every recording of Krindak's combat demonstrations available in the Academy's archives, and Katie studied them until she could predict movement patterns and tactical preferences. She practiced with her sword in the training halls during off hours, working through forms and techniques while considering how each might adapt to an opponent with 4 arms instead of to Ryan, arranged for her to use the simulation systems to model different scenarios. And Katie fought virtual opponents over and over, analyzing what worked and what didn't. In the evening before the duel, Velthor approached her in one of the training halls. I want you to know that I harbor no personal animosity, he said formally. This challenge is about answering questions that affect both our peoples. I understand, Katie replied. And I appreciate your honesty. You seem calm, Velther observed. Most opponents I've faced before combat show signs of nervousness. I'm nervous, Katie admitted. But I'm also curious to see what we can learn from each other. Velther made a sound that might have been surprise. An unusual perspective, he said. Most beings view combat as purely about victory or defeat. My teacher says that every fight is a conversation. Katie explained. The weapons are just the words we use. The Krindak's instructor considered this in silence, then nodded slowly. Perhaps there is wisdom in that view, he said. Tomorrow we will have quite a conversation. He left, and Katie returned to her quarters, where she laid out her uniform for the next day and carefully cleaned and sharpened her sword. Sleep came eventually, though her dreams were filled with images of movement and steel and plasma fire. The arena had been transformed for the duel. Its floor cleared of obstacles and marked with traditional boundary lines that have been used for honor combat since the Academy's founding. And Katie stood at one end while trying to calm her racing heart. Every gallery seat was filled, not just with Academy students and instructors, but with military officials, diplomats, and even some civilian observers who had heard about the unusual challenge. Ryan stood in the front row of the human section, his face carefully neutral, though Katie could see tension in his shoulder. Shik's sat beside him, and her presence provided Katie with a small measure of comfort. Velther entered from the opposite end, his forearms each carrying a plasma blade that hummed with barely contained energy, and his movements showed the confidence of someone who had fought hundreds of such duels. Mara Cole stood at the arena's center, her crystalline form refracting the lights and patterns that drew attention. This combat will follow traditional rules, she announced, her voice amplified across the space. First to land 3 decisive strikes wins the match. Strikes will be judged by the automated referee system, and medical teams are standing by. She looked at both combatants. This is an honor duel, which means it ends when victory is clear, she continued. Excessive force or attacks after a strike is called will result in immediate disqualification. Katie bowed in the Earth style, a gesture of respect that her people had maintained for thousands of years, and Velther returned it with the Krindak's equivalent. A crossing of his forearms across his chest, Mara Cole stepped back to the boundary line. Begin, she said. Velther moved immediately, closing the distance with speed that seemed impossible for someone his size. And his 4 plasma blades created a storm of strikes that came from every angle. Katie retreated, her sword moving in defensive patterns as she parried and deflected. And she felt the heat from the plasma blades each time they passed close to her skin. The first exchange lasted only seconds, but told Katie everything she needed to know about Velther's style. He fought with overwhelming aggression, using his 4 arms to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing opponents into defensive positions where they made mistakes. She couldn't win by defending forever. Velther pressed forward, his attacks coordinated in patterns that required Katie to move constantly, and she noticed how he used his superior reach to control the distance between them. When she tried to close in, one or more of his blades would force her back, and when she maintained distance, he advanced steadily. He's not giving her any options, someone said in the galleries. Katie let herself fall into the rhythm she had practiced for 3 days, the one that Greg had taught her when she was struggling with more experienced opponents. Stop trying to win, she thought, and start trying to understand. She began watching not just Velther's weapons, but his body positioning, the slight shifts in weight that preceded each attack, the way his secondary arms moved half a second before his primary ones. Patterns emerged from what had seemed like chaos. Velther favored certain combinations when attacking high versus low, and he had a tendency to follow circular strikes from his left arms with thrusting attacks from his right. Katie started making small adjustments to her defense, not blocking attacks directly, but positioning herself where the next strike would be less effective. "She's adapting," Zixara said quietly to Ryan. "Look how she's moving smaller steps, more efficient angles." The duel continued for 3 minutes, then 5. And Katie noticed something interesting. Velthar was breathing harder, his attacks coming slightly slower. Because maintaining a four-armed assault required enormous energy, he had expected to overwhelm her quickly. But her defense was holding, and now he was paying the price for his aggressive opening. Katie made her first real counterattack. A quick thrust that Veller blocked easily, but which forced him to adjust his positioning. She followed with a sweeping cut that he dodged, and another thrust that he parried. And each attack served not to score a hit, but to gather more information. How did he prefer to dodge? Which arms moved first when he blocked? Where did his eyes focus when she feinted? "She's not trying to win yet," an instructor observed from the galleries. "She's studying him." Velther recognized what was happening and changed his approach, becoming more cautious, using his reach advantage to probe Katie's defenses without overcommitting. They circled each other, exchanging strikes and parries. And Katie felt herself entering the state that Greg called the conversation, where conscious thought fell away and instinct guided movements. She saw an opening in Velther's defense, a moment when 3 of his 4 blades were committed to attacks and the 4th was out of position. And she took her sword, slipped through his guard, and touched his chestplate, the automated system immediately registering the strike with a clear tone. "First point to Lieutenant Morrison," Marcole announced. The galleries erupted in noise, but Katie barely heard it because she was watching Velther's reaction. His face showed surprise, but also something else: respect, perhaps, or the recognition that he had underestimated her. "Well struck," he said formally. "Thank you," Katie replied. They reset to starting positions. And when combat resumed, Velther fought differently. He was more defensive now, using his superior reach to maintain distance, and his attacks came in shorter combinations designed to minimize the openings. Katie had exploited this version of Velther. It was more dangerous because he was fighting intelligently rather than aggressively. Katie adjusted again, pushing forward more insistently, forcing him to either give ground or commit to exchanges. And each exchange gave her more information about his capabilities. She noticed that his lower left arm was slightly slower than the others, perhaps an old injury that had never fully healed. And she began targeting that side more frequently. Vira compensated by rotating his position. But compensation created its own patterns, and Katie longed each one. The second strike came after 8 minutes of continuous combat, when Katie feinted high with her sword, then dropped low and swept Velther's leading leg with enough force that the automated system registered a disabling blow. "Second point to Lieutenant Morrison," Marcole called. Now the galleries were silent, the observers recognizing that something unexpected was happening. Katie was leading 2 strikes to 0 against one of the Academy's most decorated combat instructors. Velthar's expression showed frustration but also determination. And when they reset this time, he spoke. "You fight unlike any opponent I have faced," he said. "Every exchange you learn, every defense you adapt. That's what humans do," Katie replied simply. "We learn, we adapt, we survive. Then let me show you what Krindex do." Velther said. The final phase of combat was unlike the previous 2. Velthar abandoned all caution and threw himself into an all-out assault, his 4 blades moving so fast they seemed to blur. And Katie found herself pushed to her absolute limit. She blocked, parried, deflected, and dodged, but one strike got through, touching her shoulder. "First point to Instructor Velther," Marcole announced. Katie reset, her breathing labored. And she knew that Velthor had found a new level of intensity. He came at her again with the same overwhelming aggression. And this time Katie didn't try to defend instead. She did something that went against every tactical instinct. She created an opening in her own defense. A clear path to her chest that any skilled fighter would see. Velthor saw it and committed. All four of his arms driving forward to score the decisive strike. But Katie had created the opening deliberately, had positioned herself at exactly the right distance. And in the moment when Velthor's commitment made it impossible for him to change direction, she dropped beneath his extended arms, spun inside his reach where four arms became a disadvantage rather than an asset, and placed her sword against his throat. Not a hard strike, not even a fast one. Just a gentle touch that the automated system registered as a lethal hit. Final point to Lieutenant Morrison, Mara Cole said. The duel is concluded. Complete silence held for 3 full seconds. Then applause began, starting with Zixara and Ryan, but quickly spreading to include members of dozens of species. And the sound filled the arena like thundervel. There stood perfectly still with Katie's blade still resting against his throat. And when she lowered it and stepped back, he made a gesture with all four arms that she had never seen before. I acknowledge defeat, he said formally. Then added in a quieter voice, and I thank you for the lesson. Katie bowed again. What did you learn? She asked, curious about his perspective. That victory is not always about superior weapons or greater strength. Velthor replied, sometimes it is about understanding your opponent better than they understand themselves. He gestured to the sword in Katie's hand. When I first saw that weapon, I believed it was primitive and useless, he said, speaking now to the assembled observers as well as to Katie. I was wrong, not because the sword is superior to plasma weapons, but because I failed to recognize that weapons are tools, and tools are only as effective as the person using them. Mara Cole approached them both. This duel has demonstrated something important, she said. Lieutenant Morrison has shown that technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory, and that unconventional approaches have legitimate value in combat. She turned to address the galleries, effective immediately.